Let us hear from
Sure, sure. So I am like Hilo said, I'm David Johnston coming to you from the greatest state. I don't mean to knock anyone from down there in Georgia, but the greatest state of Tennessee. Um and I must say, since you guys are going to the Tremont area, some of my favorite places in that area, because I'm there quite often, is the Peaceful Side Social and the Abbey are great places to go eat and get maybe a beverage after going to shoot. And then also, if you want coffee, the Artistic Bean is probably my favorite coffee shop, and they make great coffee drinks. So if you're going on that Tremont trip with your group, definitely hit those places up. My name's David Johnston. As Hilo said, I am going to be talking with you about the magic of waterfalls and why waterfall photography is so amazing, and maybe some of the things that are tricky about waterfall photography and some of the workarounds. And hopefully, I'm going to be sharing some information with you guys about my favorite topic in photography and in landscape photography specifically, and that's composition. It boils down to you don't need the fanciest camera on the market. You don't need to have all the best lenses. You need to have an understanding of composition because that trumps everything else every single time. I always tell people that if you understand composition, you're 90% of the way there with your photo. The other 10% may be a perspective shift or maybe a little post-processing work in the digital darkroom. But other than that, composition rules everything. And if you understand composition, you can take a great photo no matter where you are in the world, even if it's in your own backyard. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys just real quick. And like I said, we're talking about the magic of waterfall photography, how to photograph moving water, because moving water to me is why I really fell in love with photography. Waterfalls, even I've had troubles in the past with PTSD for some of the things that I did previously before photography, and waterfalls have always been kind of like my safe place. So, first of all, a little bit about me. Most important. I am a dad and a husband. I love spending time at home. Just before we started recording this session, we were talking about my daughter who just turned 5, starting big kid school, going into pre-K and kindergarten, and it is just an exciting time around our house. So that's my most important job is being a dad and a husband around our house. I am a professional photographer. I've been very grateful to work with brands like Tamron and Fujifilm and OM System and have some of my photos hung in stores like REI and other outdoor stores. And I'm also an entrepreneur helping thousands of photographers improve their photography and really unlock what's holding them back in their photography, making them more comfortable behind the camera and confident producing images that they know they're capable of. So that's a little bit about me. Like I said, living in the great state of Tennessee. But I think it all goes back. You know, a lot of people say, "Wow, you've worked with great brands. You produce photos. You get to travel all over the place." But when it first started out, I was a nobody. I was taking photos like the one you see on the left side of your screen. This is a photo that I snapped when I was hiking in Australia that just made me fall in love with photography, exploring different perspectives and having a different view and vantage point on everyday ordinary things like trees made me fall in love with photography. And I started traveling all over the place. But again, I was just this kid from Tennessee pretty much back in my younger years of going out, hiking, photographing beautiful places. And I think that it really encourages anybody who's starting out, no matter your age or experience, that anybody can do this, whether you're self-taught or you went to school for it or you've taken local classes as well. That's where I started And a lot of these images that I'm going to be sharing today are new images that nobody has seen before. So you guys get to see some of these images for the first time from my trip to Iceland, photographing waterfalls and doing a big trip out there. But like I said, having the opportunity to take these waterfall photos and learn from my experiences, I didn't have anyone helping me along the way when I was first getting started. I had to seek out a lot of that information and understand a lot of that information from trial by error. And my passion is to teach people how to take great photos so they don't have that barrier in front of them. They don't have that roadblock that's not allowing them to access their potential as a photographer. And that's my passion as a landscape photographer. So even though I've worked with these brands, I've talked on stages with National Geographic photographers, I'm just a self-taught, ordinary person who was fully obsessed with it and had the opportunity to do it before having kids. But this was the face that I made frequently after taking photos of not only being exhausted, maybe a little bit jet lagged, maybe tired from waking up with the sunrise, but for the most part, kind of a little bit confused, a little bit frustrated, maybe even dazed. And I could not figure out for the life of me what the problem was with a lot of my waterfall and moving water photography. Even though I understood the basics of camera settings, I couldn't quite nail down why my photos didn't look like this person's photos or why those look different than mine. And what was the difference here? You know, a lot of my early images may have looked something like this, where it was an interesting photo and obviously it piqued my interest. You know, I share the common thought with a lot of other photographers that if something catches your eye and makes you stop, you should probably take a photo of it. If a photo makes you say, wow, you should probably take a photo of it. And walking by scenes like this allowed me to kind of hone my photographic eye and see things a little bit differently. But there was something that was lost in translation between camera and final photo. And I don't know if you guys have felt that way too, but I know that feeling very, very well. And I just said it just a second ago. This is the question that I kept asking myself. Why can't my photos look like that? And I know that everybody watching at some point or another has thought the exact same thing. Whether you are watching a presentation like this, you're just scrolling through your phone or social media and you see a lot of great photos. You wonder, why can't my photos just look like that? Now, there are two different paths that you can go down. I opt for the path of least resistance, so that you're here in a club is amazing. I love camera clubs and photography clubs, so you're on the right track. The other track is doing it trial by error and just banging your head into a brick wall over and over and over. And that's the path I chose for some reason or another. And it made me want to set my camera on fire because I was so frustrated so many times with what I was doing. I wanted to just ignite all of my gear, get rid of it, and not really because, you know, the next day after a failed shoot, you want to get up and you want to take more photos to try to correct it. But when you're obsessed, the frustration you feel after a shoot can be insurmountable, but you always get up the next day and you always try to keep going. And I knew I had to make a change, right? I knew I couldn't keep feeling this way. I had to figure this out. And I finally made the changes that we're going to be talking about today, about how you actually go about composing images like this, finding locations, seeing them a little bit differently. And my favorite thing to talk about is actually using basic geometric shapes to understand what a landscape is. And this is a quote that really changed how I saw landscape photography and how I saw waterfall photography for the most part. And that quote is, "The river is relentless, always moving forward, never giving up." And it just always resonated with me to say, okay, this river is constantly finding the easiest way. It's finding its way around things, even if it's been dammed by a beaver colony. It finds ways through, around, over to the side. It's always changing, it's always adapting. And I think a lot of photographers should adapt that same way of thinking of the river is relentless, always moving forward, never giving up. There are always new technologies that come out. There are always new opportunities for photography. And with waterfall, no waterfall ever looks the same, no matter when you go. It could look different the next morning you're there. And you may have heard it said, okay, whoever spends the most money on gear gets the best photos. So that's not true. It's whoever understands compositions, whoever understands how things work in the scene and in the frame and the settings to use and all that, or whoever has the most followers takes the best photos. It's also not true. There are a lot of people with a lot of followers, and actually, now talking about followers, it's kind of a moot point because things have changed so much in the last year. We should really look at what the best photo is, and it's the simplest of quotes from our forefather of landscape photography, and that is the best photo is knowing where to stand. And you may be thinking about, okay, Ansel, like I understand that quote, I see what you're saying, but he's really saying something much deeper here. It's not just knowing where to stand, it's where to shift your camera to the left or right just slightly. It's where to lower your tripod just a little bit. It's where to peek through a natural window and see composition differently. So I'm going to show you how to do a lot of different things in this presentation. Master waterfall photography is basically what I want you to take away from this, right? Um, Now, I'm also going to leave time at the end for a little bit of Q&A so that we can have a little bit of a back and forth with each other, which is, I think, one of my favorite things to do with photography clubs as well. So let's hop in here. Gear needed. This is pretty basic stuff. We'll get into the more advanced stuff pretty easily, but if you've never tried waterfall photography, this is definitely where you need to start. Gear needed. It's not a long laundry list of gear, and it's not really going to cost you all that much. Actually, probably you already have everything that you need. Gear needed, you need a camera, you need a lens, you need a solid tripod, and a circular polarizer. Now, a lot of people have asked me in the past, hey, Dave, what is the most important one of these that I need to get my hands on? And you may think, okay, it's the camera, it's the lens, it's the polarizer. It's actually the tripod, because a lot of the best compositions for waterfall photography is in the water, standing in the water, getting your feet wet a little bit. I've been known to take my shoes and socks off and dip into the Smoky Mountain rivers and try to get the best composition with numb feet and everything in the winter. But you need a solid tripod for this, not only for the best compositions if you're brave enough to get out there or want the best compositions or the best perspectives on things. Not saying that you can't get any without doing that, but you also need a solid tripod because the exposures are going to be a little bit lengthened than what you typically would shoot at a big grand overlook. It's going to be a slightly longer exposure speed than you're used to with just your basic snapshot. Now, the gear I'm using, most recently, I switched over to OM system cameras, just smaller, lightweight, durable. Not sponsored by them. I just wanted to switch over and try something new. So I'm using their OM1 Mark II. OM System 8 to 25 f4 is primarily my waterfall lens. We'll get into using telephoto lenses as well in this presentation. And Gitzo tripod. I also use a Photo Pro tripod on occasion, but the Gitzo is kind of my go-to. And a circular polarizer. I'm using Nisi and Case circular polarizers at the moment. I think gear, for the most part, for me, when we're talking about waterfall photography and selecting a right camera, maybe you're looking at getting a new camera. When you're thinking about waterfalls specifically, maybe that may be your main niche of photography, or you want to try that out a lot. A good weather sealed camera is pretty top of the list for me. Now we're getting into the phase of technology that everything is great technology. Everybody makes great sensors. For me, it's weather sealing. How durable is the camera? How much of the elements can it take? Because a lot of waterfall photography involves going out really early in the morning, really late in the evening. You're going in cold conditions because you're going out on the edges of the day. And it's best a lot of times. My favorite photography weather for waterfalls is actually a little bit of mist and rain. So my cameras are getting pretty wet regularly when I'm going out and photographing waterfalls. Now, I'm sorry to all the camera companies who send me cameras to review because this is my jet spray test. I put the jet setting on my water hose and I spray the entire camera down. And if it has any moisture on the inside, I send it back to them and say, I will not use this camera because it can't hold up to the conditions. But a lot of cameras do a great job of weather sealing. I think your basic ones, Nikon, Canon, Sony, Fuji, OM system, which used to be Olympus, are great. Pentax is also great. So you're probably going to be just fine on weather sealing with your camera. And believe it or not, your camera can actually take a lot more pain than you're inflicting on it. Don't be nervous to get it out into some of those conditions. Wide angle lenses produce waterfalls like this. They're a wider scene. They get a larger field of view. Some people say, what about an ultra wide versus a wide angle lens? I don't think it matters too much, just as much as you can get into the foreground sometimes with a lot of these smaller waterfalls. And for your group, this is in the Tremont area of the Smokies, so you can actually go to this waterfall, which you'll be seeing a few different times in this presentation. But it is just great to get down low, get different perspectives using a wide angle lens, and it just gives you a lot more flexibility to try out different foregrounds. Remember, the waterfall stays the same. Creativity really ramps up when you try different areas using different ways to pull your viewer into the frame. More on that in just a little while. This is also a wide angle scene, same area, the Tremont area. And this was taken just a wide angle shot really quickly, jumping up on a rock and framing up this composition because it was very foggy this morning, so foggy that you could barely see, 20 yards ahead of you. And all of a sudden, in the snap of a finger, the sun came out, the fog dissipated, but it was still lingering around in the treetops. I wanted to jump up on this rock and snap a photo where all of that lush spring neon green was reflecting off of all of that fog and atmosphere that was in the treetop canopy. I wanted to jump up and capture that because without it, you can see a lot of the sky through this photo, and it's not the same without that fog. So you want to be on your toes with a lot of the weather conditions, cloudy days, foggy days, misty, dreary days. Those are some of the best times to get out and photograph waterfalls because it disperses the light more. It acts as a large diffuser over the earth so that you can photograph even light, no harsh shadows, no harsh highlights. And the added bonus to that is there are much less crowds during those times as well. Now, if you're opting towards something like a medium range lens or a
Grabbed a
telephoto
ship.
lens,
USS Iowa. Fortunately, it blew up in the water.
I think we have one microphone that's turned on. There we go. Okay. Thank you. If you're opting towards more of a medium range lens or a telephoto lens, when you zoom in on a scene, it does something different than a wide angle. It actually compresses all of that distance a little bit more. So your objects and subjects seemed more stacked on top of one another. You may have seen this with photos of mountain peaks into the distance that are stacked closer together. You can do the same thing with waterfalls. I find it's a lot more fun when you have kind of a minimal waterfall or maybe a large pond area in front of a waterfall to use something like a telephoto lens to create more of a minimal scene rather than try to force a foreground into the composition. Now, I like to get out in the water, like I said. I like to get on wet rocks. It's not always as easy for everybody. The older I get, This was me when this was probably 10 years ago. So I've had more knee injuries and surgeries since that point, but I still like to get out into the water and in the rocks. And it just allows you to get more perspectives on things. If you see the photo on the far left, that's a high perspective up on a bridge over this mountain stream. The photo in the middle is in Iceland. You get up underneath and behind this waterfall, and if you can keep the majority of the mist off of your camera, you can really play with a low perspective shooting up towards the sky and getting the whole cave view of this waterfall where you're able to walk behind it. The photo on the right is also from the Tremont area that you guys may see, and it's getting out into the water, getting your feet wet. And getting right up close using an ultra wide lens to get that little cascade of water off of the foreground and out into the water, just to bring that audience in. You know, those stretching foregrounds, those larger than life foregrounds act as anchor points to pull your viewer into the photo and stick around and explore a little bit longer. Now, the circular polarizer is just a circular filter that you can screw onto the end of your lens. And basically what this does is it will remove glare off of the surface of the water. It can also remove glare off of plants and reflections off of plants and glossy leaves like rhododendrons in the Smokies as well. Here's an example of a photograph using a circular polarizer. This is up a little bit more northwest of Chattanooga in Grundy County, Tennessee. And this is a waterfall with a lot of interesting rock formations underneath the surface of the water. If you see right underneath the surface of the water in the front of the lens, without a circular polarizer, all of that is light reflection and a lot of distracting highlights off of the surface of the water. But when you use a circular polarizer, you can photograph that and it really reduces the amount of reflection. Now, the fun thing about this presentation is you guys can see a little bit of drawing going on as well. So you see all of this right in here, right in the bottom, with all these rocks. What this does is it actually pulls the viewer into the frame this way. And once they're met with the actual water, they kind of go up this ridge, find the waterfall, and then they can follow this ridge back down. And you follow, it's a cyclical pattern in your photography. And this is one of the main points of composition that a lot of people don't talk about. It's the visual flow of your photography. Do your orientated subjects have a cyclical flow? Can you explore the photo more than once? Do you wrap around? Do you recycle your attention in an image using the cyclical flow of the pattern? And circular polarizers are a great trick to do that with. Another example from Iceland, this is called Brurfoss, and it is a little bit outside of the Golden Circle near a town called Lagervatn. And it is a really fun place to go. This is how blue the water actually is. It's insane how blue this water is based on the mineral content of the water, and it's just a really interesting place to go. But without a circular polarizer, it's tough to get that blue into your image because of the reflection. Here's the wide angle version of this photo. This is a telephoto version, and here's the wide angle version of this waterfall and river that runs towards a bridge that you can overlook it. Has the actual color of the water, but using a circular polarizer to really look through the glare on the surface of the water so that you can see those really interesting aqua colors that occur naturally in that water. So circular polarizers are really important when it comes to photography. A couple examples of not using one versus using one. You see this photo that's on your screen right now. A circular polarizer was not used here. An interesting scene, but since the circular polarizer wasn't used, I was using more of a mid-range lens, about 45 millimeters, and using a circular polarizer on this wasn't an option for me because I didn't have the right thread size. And you can see that reflection of a lot of that water in the little pool down in front of the waterfalls. Using a wide angle lens, you see the different version of how close you can get to that. The wide angle lens here uses the circular polarizer. You can still see a little bit of that white reflection, but for the most part, that's removed off of the surface of the water so that you can see a lot of those natural colors. You don't have a lot of distracting highlights in the photo, and your attention can be drawn to the actual waterfalls a little bit more. Now, this isn't necessarily a waterfall photo, but using the motion of water and blurring some of the streaks of water out to sea to your advantage is really fun to do because you can, again, using a circular polarizer, you can look through a lot of that water to black sand or any rocks that are occurring underneath that, maybe shells on a different ocean on a white sand beach. You can see all that white through the surface of the water. So you're removing all of those distracting highlights. And a fun tip about this, I know it's not waterfall photography, but I'll share a little bonus tip here with you. If you're photographing seascapes or anything like this is at Diamond Beach in Iceland. Photograph when the water is going back out to sea. You see how it kind of wraps around that chunk of ice and how it kind of makes little loops around the edges where it's touching the sand. And then you can see the motion of the water pulling back out to sea. That actually acts kind of like a visual trick to pull your viewer into the frame and allow them to inspect more of the photo rather than the water coming at you and creating more friction between the viewer and the actual photo. There are also different options when it comes to a lot of the mist getting on your camera. You know, some of the other pieces of gear you might want here are a rocket blaster or those, lens cloths. You need a lot of those. Sometimes you can get photos that don't have any water droplets, and then sometimes you just can't avoid it, right? This is a cave. I was being blasted with water nonstop, and I just thought, forget it. I'm just going to take the photo with water droplets on it. I don't really care that much. But a rocket blaster and also a lot of lens cloths can come in handy when you are out taking a lot of these photos. Because if a long exposure is happening, you can use that air blower, that rocket blaster, to blast all of the water droplets off of your lens, or you can use a lens cloth to quickly clean that away. Now, when it comes to camera settings, this is kind of an interesting topic because I have a starting out system that I use for camera settings for waterfall photography, and that is half a second exposure, f16 ISO 100. And that's what I start out with every single waterfall. Now, that's not to say that's where the settings end with each one of my waterfall photos. That is just where I start and a good starting place for my waterfall photography. Half a second, f16 ISO 100. Now, there's some wiggle room here because those are the exact settings for this shot of Kirkjufell in Iceland. Half a second f16 ISO 100. But this is a pretty slow moving waterfall. Even though it is a bigger waterfall than we're used to, maybe in Georgia or Tennessee, it's still a pretty trickling waterfall. It's not super ferocious. It's not really, really high. But there is something to be said about slower moving water and capturing it. The goal of waterfall photography and selecting the right shutter speed is to get enough motion in your water. If I can get my pen out real quick, the motion of this water, but still see some of the textures in the water, especially when it hits the water and disperses at the bottom of the waterfall. You want to see a lot of those streaks coming into the frame, right? So you see all this water coming over the edge. You can see the individual streaks of water here. It's not overexposed where they're completely white, but you can still see a lot of that waterfall action. Now, when you have a little bit heavier of a flow of water, like this is Skogafoss in Iceland. You see how powerful this waterfall is, right? This is only 1/20th of a second, f16 ISO 200. This is midnight sun photo, so it's midnight here during this photo, but having something like 1/20th of a second, because this water is moving so fast, I still want you to see all these textures of the little streams of water coming down, but then also have it moving fast enough that it creates a little bit of motion there. So it's this balancing act when you're photographing waterfalls of creating texture, but still seeing the individual streaks of water in there too. So a little bit of a long exposure to streak that water out, but also seeing that texture in there. Also with these, you may want to freeze motion a little bit more with your waterfall photography, depending on the how ferocious or powerful the actual waterfall is. Especially if you look right in here with the water, you can see a lot of this isn't super long exposure, right? This is probably about 1/50th of a second, pretty fast exposure, but this water is moving so fast that it looks a little bit streaked. Now, in this waterfall right here, you can see that the water is frozen a little bit more. That's just based on a faster shutter speed, because sometimes you have foregrounds or natural windows that you're using in your framing in your photography, and I didn't want all these grasses to be blurred in the foreground of the photo. So it's a little bit of a balancing act, a give and take. What do I want to do here? These photos that you get where we're located, Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, a lot of the southeast waterfalls can be mountain streams like this. This is a pretty slow moving waterfall. So this is about more like 1 to 1.5 to 2 second exposure speed, because that water is moving so slowly. This is also in the Tremont area if you guys are interested in that. Now, you can get photos using something. I know some of you are probably thinking, okay, what about ND filters, right? You talked about circular polarizers. What about ND filters? Well, ND filters can have a cool impact on a waterfall. You can see that it did create a lot of those textures and milky white motions going on in the waterfall down here. A lot of really nice reflections in the midground from the sunrise above. But if you look back here at the main waterfall all the way in the back, what you're getting is just a big chunk of white. I kind of steer away from using ND filters with my waterfall photography, just because they have a tendency to lengthen the exposure too much, and you lose a lot of that texture. Like what I like to do with my waterfalls is have a lot of texture coming out from the last waterfall, and you can see in this one there's a lot of white and not much texture in there. Now, on the flip side, when you use a little bit faster of an exposure speed, something like that half second that we talked about, you can create something like this. This isn't a half second, it's 1 second long, a 1 second exposure f/16 ISO 100. But this waterfall was moving so fast because of a heavy rain that had just happened, that it was creating water bubbles on the surface of the water that were not popping and moving downstream at a very quick rate. So being the photographer I am, I thought, why not just jump in the middle of this fast moving stream? And this is why my wife says she doesn't like me going on photo trips by myself, but I jumped out there, created this composition, and used all these water bubbles in a 1 second long exposure to streak towards the camera and pull the viewer into the frame. And this is a trick that you guys can use too. It doesn't have to be water bubbles. It can be swirls in waterfalls. It can be outflows of the water that can create a lot of motion that people can follow into the frame. Here's another example of that. All the outflow of water and all the colors that you can create using some of the longer exposures, like 1 second to 2 seconds. If you see, this is what I'm talking about with outflow. We want to see where that water is going and the resolution to it. When you think about landscape photography, especially waterfall photography, taking a photo is exactly like writing a good book. When you read a good book, you know it because there is a introduction, there is a friction in the middle of the book, a problem, and there is a solution at the end of the book. That is the typical way a story is written. A photograph is no different. You get the introduction, you get the middle of the photo, the bulk, that's where the subject is, and you have to have a conclusion. Had this photo been cut off before the conclusion, you wouldn't know where that main character was going, and it would be like ending the book 3 chapters too early on a cliffhanger with no resolution at all. And I know we've all read books like that that are just so frustrating. So a photo is the exact same thing, especially with your composition. Create images that have a visual flow, that have a story to them, that outflow, that circular motion that we talked about. Let's take this photo, for example, here when we're talking about composition. We're going to get a little bit more into composition in just a little while, but I wanted to pull this in here because I used a higher perspective for this shot. And I used this little wave in the water, this rock formation that has been cut um, by years of flow from the waterfall. I use it as a foreground to kind of twirl you back into the frame. Now it brings you right to the waterfall here, right? But where do you get the outflow from? You get all that outflow from the waterfall. It takes you down to this part of the photo in the bottom left. And this rock formation, using a circular polarizer so you can see through it to the bottom, brings you back to the foreground. So there's that cyclical flow, that circular pattern that you can follow over and over and over. And this is what a great composition is, a great photo is just using that cyclical pattern over and over and over. This is one of my favorite photos that I shot in the Tremont area during fall. So hopefully you guys can see one of these scenes when you go out there. But just a really fun photo. I'm going to get deeper into this one in just a second, but you can also take photos like this that are just basic natural designs or natural patterns that occur in the flow of the water when it dips down and hits a rock and lifts back up. You can take a lot of what I like to call intimate designs in nature, or small designs or natural designs, where the water does something interesting and you get a lot of that reflection off of the surface of the water, especially in fall when you get those yellow leaves. You can get a lot of cool reflections off of the surface of the water. Play around with your exposure speeds and try to create something that's kind of otherworldly or confusing that the viewer has to figure out. Let's dive deep into composition though, so we can really see this. And composition in photography is dialed down to one simple phrase: increase attraction, decrease distraction. Increase your attraction to the subject of the photo, decrease any distraction out of the photo that takes you away from your subject. In simplest forms, that's what composition is. Over and over and over, it takes several different photos of the same things. Every single frame, you're increasing attraction, decreasing distraction. And that's how you create a good image. That's composition in its simplest terms. Increased attraction, decreased distraction. Let's take you through this photo here that I showed you just a second ago from Tremont. A beautiful fall scene. You have the waterfall here, and you have big foreground elements that are down in the bottom of the frame, right? They're dotted with the fall leaves that have fallen. I did not go out there and place these leaves there. They were just like this when I arrived, and I was like, oh, perfect. Had coffee in hand. I was vibing with this photo. It was awesome. And I used these two big rocks down in the foreground to pull the viewer into the frame, using the foreground to direct the viewer exactly where I want them to look within the frame. With these rocks, it was pretty easy because they're kind of going directly to the two main flows of the waterfall that are in the actual waterfall itself, that is in the square here. So you can use foregrounds to your advantage as arrows, pointing your viewer exactly where you want them to look. Now, the trick is, in what order do you want them to look there? If you see, the waterfall is the next exact thing after these foreground objects. I want you to see that waterfall directly after these objects, and that's kind of where this is. Now, these rocks on the other sides, the lines on the striations of the rocks of, the I'm losing the word rocks, not geography, but I'll think of it later. But also the edge of the stream on the other side is right there too. Now, I think this is where that's where a lot of photographers stop with composition, right? When you dive deeper into composition, you need to not think of objects. Think instead of shapes within your landscape photography. And when I'm talking about shapes, your basic geometric patterns. So rocks and trees can become triangles. And not just the rocks and trees themselves, but also negative spaces in between them. You can create negative space windows that are also the same shapes, triangles. You see these rocks on the sides, they can also be triangles. And triangles are the most impactful objects that you can use in landscape photography because they're literal arrows that you can pull and point to using those specific shapes. So you can bring your viewer in with a triangle, have them look directly at something because the end of an arrow is literally a triangle. So it's nature's way of pointing you directly to something. Now, if you look at this photo, beautiful scene, nice atmosphere, some nice fog and mist hanging around in the treetop canopies, a nice mountain stream rolling through the bottom of the photo, but it's a little bit disjointed. You don't really know where to look. Is it beautiful? Absolutely. But this would be a great example of the first photo that you're starting out with, right? You see something beautiful, you take a snapshot, but then you look at the photo and you're saying, okay, what am I actually trying to accomplish here, right? What is the attraction? What's the subject? For me, it would probably be kind of this chunk of tree canopy over here. Now, what I'm trying to do with composition is increase attraction, decrease distraction. So what I'm using are all these little areas of white water I would reframe this to bring you more towards this section of the photo. This might be a good photo situation to use more of a mid-range or telephoto lens and get a different perspective on too, because there's no strong foreground to use here, and I don't want to force one into the actual image. So that kind of gives you a look at an initial photo that you might take that might need some more work and some tweaking to get exactly where you want it to be. Now, we're talking about waterfalls specifically, but there's also that idea of moving water. And this was the best example that I had to kind of illustrate this point of how do you photograph moving water, right? Well, moving water is always moving. It's constantly changing. It's constantly finding a way around rocks. That could be a seascape like this one. You use the water to lead your viewer into the frame, right? Increase attraction, decrease distraction. What would be distracting in this frame that I would try to remove from it? Is the line from the actual wave that's crashed on the shore directing you to the actual subject of the photo, the sea stack in the distance? This is probably photo number 30 from the series that I was trying to get exactly how I wanted it to be, the motion through the foreground of the photo. So it's not just one image that photographers are taking. We're taking multiple images because we can foresee what could be possible, and then we try and try again to create exactly what that is. Now, for a telephoto shot, something like this using composition, what I'm trying to do here is guide you through the frame through a lot of chaos, make order out of chaos. So I'm taking you from the top of the frame. You can kind of follow this one line all the way down to the bottom where there's the larger section of water standing. And then you have all these little flows of waterfall kind of dipping you down into the frame like so. A pretty fast shutter speed because you can see a lot of the spray coming off of these little waterfalls down here. So probably more like 1/20th of a second with this one. But you can see this specific line that I'm trying to guide you down using that motion of the water, using the changing shape, constant adjusting. Again, took multiple photos here, trying to get the spray and the water flow exactly how I wanted it. But when you keep trying with that, you can create some really impactful photos. Now, when we're talking about landscape photographer, now when we're talking about landscape photography and taking a good image, right? We talked about the story. Your story has to have a good beginning, middle, and ending, right? A lot of times the middle is where all the action is. Here's the introduction to a waterfall back here. Here's the bulk of the story right in the middle part of Brewerfoss. But you also have to have a conclusion. What's happening down at the very bottom? You have this little conclusion trail coming out of the waterfall at the very bottom. That's the conclusion of the waterfall, the conclusion of the story. Where is it moving on to next? And adding that into the composition on purpose so that you have that little outflow of conclusion in your waterfall photography. Had this been cut off a little bit shorter, you would completely lose that, and it would kind of be this abrupt ending to the middle of the part of your story. We want to be good authors as photographers. We're just using a single image to tell an entire story. It's a skill set that we as photographers have this distinct power and purpose to an ability to see and create in our photography. So why not put it to the best action as possible and really hone in those skills on composition of creating good stories, creating good photos as well. Here's another example of that. We looked at this photo a little bit earlier, talking about cyclical flow and a cyclical recycled pattern of visual interest. If you see in here, I don't think I have the slide in here, all these triangles that are occurring in the bottom of the frame, all these jagged rocks are just triangles in the foreground pulling you into the photo. That's where I wanted you to start with this. You see, you're directed directly into the photo using these. You find the waterfall back here through the foreground, and then you see all this space for outflow of water right through here, where you have all this negative space, but it just gives the viewer more of a chance to circle back to the foreground and then back to the waterfall and then back to the outflow. Cyclical pattern over and over and over again. That's a great composition. And they don't come very often. So when you're able to create one, you're able to construct one that has this cyclical pattern, you don't forget it. You see it, you love it over and over, and that's the beauty of photography. Now, I also want to talk about in composition, not leaving anything out of the story, right? Important details or skimping on any details. I read a book recently that was missing a huge chunk of information on one of the characters, and it left me confused for the entire rest of the story. Now, for this photo, the main subject is Kirkjufell back here, but the introductory, maybe even the complementary subject, is this little waterfall. Now you see this island that's kind of scattered throughout the bottom right of the photo. What I've seen a lot of photos do here is focus more on the actual mountain of Kirkjufell when they just cut off this section of the bottom of the photo. What this does is it cuts off this entire stream of water that goes from the waterfall down through the rest of the frame that can lead you back up to the mountain itself. So you want to be sure when you're taking a photo, you're doing a little bit of edge patrol. You're trying to find little areas that maybe you cut off a little bit too soon that need some more wiggle room for the viewer to navigate through the frame, find different sections that they can look through and navigate through the entire photo. Because there's nothing worse than feeling stuck in an image or confused about a character or complementary subject that you've purposefully included into the frame that you then need to explain as the photographer. You want to make it very self-explanatory to your audience that you are photographing this. Why am I photographing this? What does this have to do with anything? In simplest terms, again, increase attraction, decrease distraction. Now, once you've done all that, I know it's a mouthful, maybe your head's spinning, but this could be the most important question that you ask yourself as a photographer. What else is here? We, as photographers, get so honed in and tunnel vision on one thing, especially when we're talking about honing in a composition and getting it exactly how we want it to be. We lose sight of everything else that's around us. So, yes, work on that composition, hone in on it, but also ask yourself, what else is here? How is this going to change? Is this waterfall going to be different later on in the year? Are there other waterfalls around me that I'm not even noticing? And I would encourage you to go out to locations more than once, more than twice, more than three times, more than four times. These three waterfalls here are actually the exact same waterfalls, three of the exact same waterfall. And this is all three of them are in the Tremont area of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. This one is the exact same waterfall in the Tremont area of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. This waterfall is on the way to that waterfall in Tremont in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So you can find all these places, photograph them at different times of the year. Now, all of this education that we've been going through, and I asked your group president if I could kind of share something with you guys that I work on that's near and dear to my heart. It's called Landscape Photography University. I'm actually running a sale right now, but I've taught tons of photographers how to do this, all the drawing. We do a live photo critique every single week for our members for Landscape Photography University. And they are able to submit their photos, and I draw all over them, show them what they're improving on, how they maybe can make some changes or things to consider in the future. And they have really loved doing this. People like Trey is winning awards in his local area. Mike is started out taking photos like the cactus on the top, kind of a cool photo, a lot of distractions, but now he's taking photos. His friends asked him if that's from a magazine. So it's cool to see them improve. People like Dave Cummings, who's been one of our members from the very beginning, talking about how much he's improved. I'm running a deal right now. So what you're getting with this deal is a complete system, a total of 15 video courses on landscape photography. That includes the editing masterclass that's going to show you how to photograph with Lightroom and Photoshop. And those are updated as there are improvements to those two softwares or changes to those two softwares. So you're always up to date. Like I said, weekly live photo critiques, an LPU digital ebook, and access to the vault, which includes tons of different interviews and presentations from other professional photographers from our photography summits that we do exclusively for LPU members. Totaling all these values at $3,691. I'm running the deal right now for $97. This is the QR code for that. This is a yearly membership to LPU. I'm doing a free 7-day trial and 100%, it's back to 100% buy our money back guarantee as well. So you can try this out for 7 days. If you don't like it, you don't have to stick around. If you do like it, you find it informational, you're saving 97% with this deal. So it's a pretty big savings that you have with this deal. You have the QR code here. I know live and in the replay. I'll also put it in the live chat that we have in Zoom, but I also want to open this up for Q&A if you guys have any questions as well. I'm going to stop sharing here, but I am also going to put that into the group chat for you guys real quick.
David, first
Yeah.
of all, I'd say thank you. Very, very well done. Very well orchestrated presentation. We appreciate that.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome.
I had to step away for about 5 minutes and I may have missed it, so I'm going to ask the question.
Uh-huh.
Several of your photos show a strong foreground element that is tack sharp, and then the waterfall and the trees behind it and everything else is also sharp. So my question is, even though wide angle and small sensors help with depth of field, how did you get it all sharp? Do you focus stack?
That's a good question. I am, and here's the link for you guys in the chat if you guys want to get that. I am what you would call a lazy photographer. So if I can use something called hyperfocal distance, I tend to do
Yeah.
that.
Okay.
And using something like f16 allows me to use hyperfocal distance with it. If you're unsure of that, you basically use something like f16, a very small aperture opening, and that gives you the most amount of quote unquote acceptable focus. And you focus halfway between a third of the way into the frame and the bottom of the frame on a hard edge of a subject, and then everything else into the frame is in acceptable focus. Now, sometimes I will use focus stacking just to be safe. And then sometimes when the foreground is really, really close, I will use focus stacking. That image with all the triangular shapes of the rocks in the foreground, that was focus stacked because I was literally sitting on a rock with my legs completely out to the side to try and get them out of the frame. So I was right.
That was the one that made me want to ask the question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I was right on top of those rocks. So yeah, you definitely do have to use focus stacking at times, which a lot of people are afraid to do, but honestly, focus stacking is super simple to do. It takes 3 clicks of a mouse in Photoshop to get everything pretty
Yeah,
fast.
I'm a Photoshop imbecile and even I can do it. So
See, there you go. You have your proof.
thanks.
Yep. I see we have a question down in the chat says, have you ever shot Niagara Falls? How did you deal with the mist? I have shot Niagara Falls before, but not too seriously. I was pretty far away. I was actually using a telephoto for the shot just to get it small details within the bigger waterfall. But dealing with the mist, I mean, if you're taking the boat down to the bottom of Niagara Falls, you're going to be struggling a lot with the mist because it's pretty intense down there. You can use the rocket blaster to try to blow off any of the water droplets from the end of your lens. One trick that I've used a lot, and let me grab a lens real quick from back here. Um, I'll just use this one. One trick that I've used a lot is using manual focus and manual settings. And then I will clean off the end of my lens and just put the lens cloth on top of the end of the lens. And then I'll set my camera to a 2-second timer. Now I'll listen in my ear for that 2-second timer to get close. And right before it takes the photo, I'll just pull the cloth off and then put it right back on after. And usually that takes care of a lot of the mist, manageable enough to be able to clone stamp some of that out in Lightroom or Photoshop or something like Luminar if you're using that software. But that's another good trick. If you don't have a lens cloth, you can also use a hat. Pretty much anything. I've used a wet sock. It's disgusting, but when you're in a pinch, you got to do what works.
Got any more questions?
Yeah, I've got one. Rick asked a question about focus stacking, which thanks, Rick, for bringing that up. Uh, what's your take on bracketing exposures when you're going from getting that texture look to the shave cream look? How do you kind of balance that? Because sometimes it gets blown out pretty good.
Yeah, that's a good question. For waterfalls specifically, I do not bracket any shots, just because it can create some kind of different artifacts down in the water because water is always shifting, especially the little sprays that can come off of some of the cascades in water. So I will not, for the water specifically, do any bracketing. If I'm struggling with exposure or looking at the histogram and something looks a little bit blown out, I will expose, and this is a little bit differently than other people. I'll expose the waterfall a little bit low and get it a little bit dark and just try to bring that back in post. And then if it's a problem with the background or the midground or something that's not the water, I will even bracket the background and blend that into the waterfall shot so that I still maintain that waterfall without brackets, but then I'm just masking the rest in. That again, that's like one shot out of 100 that I'm going to do that with. Typically, I'm trying to do things within one shot or within a focus stack. But there are those situations where you run into that it's nice to have that knowledge of how to mask and blend several different shots that you're trying to put together to create a vision.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Some of your photos of the waterfalls had some pink reflections on them. Is that from the variable density filter?
Are you talking about the one that I was talking about, the ND filter with the long exposure?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was an interesting shot. That was actually from the Tremont area, so that same waterfall that I showed several times.
Correct.
But it was in February, so there were no leaves on the trees. And we had an insane sunrise when we were out there photographing, and it was actually the reflection of the sky, the pink sky, off of the surface of the water. So it was because of the neutral density filter that I was using and no circular polarizer. So all that reflection was coming off of the surface of the water. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I
Yeah,
thought
you're
it
welcome.
would have been that dreaded X that happens with the variable density filters. That's why I was asking.
Yeah, yeah.
Anybody else? It's been a fantastic presentation.
Thank you. I really appreciate you guys.
Yeah, thanks, David. Really well done.
Thank you so much. Somebody saying, newbie, can you explain an ND filter versus a polarizer? Yeah, give me one quick second. Dive into my bag of tricks over here. Okay. So there are different filters that you can put. The circular polarizer, like I said in the presentation, removes glare off of the surface of the water. And it's a circle like this that you screw onto the end of your lens. And as you spin it, it will either keep the reflection on the water or it will remove the reflection so that you can see a little bit under the water. They act like polarized sunglasses that you can buy. So you can see it's a little bit opaque. It may darken the scene a little bit, but you still have a lot of light coming through there. Now, an ND filter is much, much different because it doesn't act like a polarizer does, but it's much darker. You see how much darker this is. It's like a solid piece of black glass. But this will probably lengthen exposures, a half second more at most. This one will lengthen it up to 50 seconds if you put it on there. So they're different, and you can get different harshness of ND filters. So like an ND 60 all the way up to 1,000 or more. But that's just the main difference of those that you can get those. Now, circular polarizers and ND filters, you can get ones like this that screw on or slide in. They also create magnetic filters that I've found to be quite handy. But they make all kinds of filters now that you can get around. So why use an ND? NDs are great for really, really long exposures of overlooks. So I use NDs with high perspectives on something like a seascape to get smooth out a lot of big water. And it can also create a lot of really interesting reflections from the sky, like we were talking about with Umit just a second ago. Yeah. So that's why I use ND filters, not specifically with waterfalls, but with larger bodies of water, like lakes, ponds, sometimes with oceans too.
David, just a quick note in passing. I enjoyed your comment about looking for shapes instead of other stuff. Uh, I realize when I go out and shoot them, I really don't practice that. So hopefully next time around I'll be able to act on your advice. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. It takes practice. I think it's the easiest to do with foregrounds when you can see triangles and rocks, and then you'll start to see them if you go out and photograph mountains. Triangles are everywhere there. And then you might know this, but if you're kind of a night photographer, moons or star trails can create a lot of circular patterns and interesting patterns in the night sky. So that's another distinct pattern that or shape that you can work with too. And if you're starting to see those things or you want to work on seeing those things too.
Any more? Well, I'm going to stop the recording now.